Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. In the fast-paced world of today, wars are waged not only on battlefields, but also in the realm of information and emotions. In Ukraine, one aspect of this war has been the struggle for identity, with Russia repeatedly trying to downplay the importance of Ukraine's cultural uniqueness and heritage. A very important appeal has recently appeared concerning the way in which we refer to places in Ukraine, a call to the Western media to cast aside the vestiges of Soviet dominance. Joining us now is Arthur Barys, head language editor at TVP World. Hello and welcome.
Happy to be here.
So first, let's talk about what this appeal is really about, because we often hear certain names being pronounced in many different ways, but only one is correct, because it is Ukrainian and not Russian. It is referring, after all, to places in Ukraine.
True. What we need to remember is that for centuries of Russian dominance in Ukraine, a lot of these place names have their Russian versions and their Ukrainian versions. And when we write about these places or speak about them in English, we somehow need to map the Russian or Ukrainian versions onto English, and it's our choice which way we do it. What Ukraine is asking us to do is to acknowledge that they have their own names, they have their own pronunciation, and make the conscious choice to use these when we speak or write about Ukraine as an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of their state.
So essentially, these are names like Kyiv and not Kiev, Odessa and not Odessa with a double S. The differences may be subtle to someone who has lived in the West all their lives, although Ukrainians, this is actually a very important signal, isn't it?
Yes, because language is an inherent part of a national identity, and specifically in Ukraine, these place names, because they're so subtly different from the Russian versions, it's very important for Ukrainians to make sure that when we talk about their language and their toponyms and their last names in English, we use the versions that are most similar to the way Ukrainians actually pronounce and write them when they speak Ukrainian.
Conversely, the Russians will often insist on the old Soviet versions because they want to imprint that identity onto Ukraine, as if Ukraine had not been a free country for decades now.
Yes, well, what the Kremlin is doing is a particularly insidious form of hybrid warfare that's taking place not on the battlefield, but in the realm of language. And what's interesting about this specific battlefield is that it's not taking place in Ukrainian or Russian, it's taking place in the language of a third party, in the global language of English. We've seen many countries decolonize in the past, and what they've done is they've chosen to use their local native names, such as Mumbai or Myanmar, instead of Bombay and Burma. What's interesting about this specific example is that we have two countries duking it out over how we're going to talk about Ukraine in a third party. And I mean, this is, the difference might seem subtle, but at the end of the day, language isn't just a tool which we use to communicate with each other, to spread ideas and facts. Language is essentially the way we shape our reality and the way we think about the reality around us. And the Kremlin knows this. So the Kremlin is insidiously using this to get people to think of Ukraine through the filter of the Kremlin, of Moscow, to get people to think of Ukraine as just a Russian colony.
Would you say that this is, in a way, a type of symbolic violence, what Russia is doing and has been doing for the last couple of years?
It definitely is. And what makes it so aggressive and so effective is that the people that it targets aren't usually aware that they're being targeted. Like, you'll see propaganda outlets in the United States use the Russian spelling of Kiev, which is the first and last time you're going to hear me say that on the air. And the readers of these outlets don't necessarily understand that they're reading a Russian point of view.
Are you referring to propaganda outlets, so outlets which on the surface appear to be American, however they might actually have their sources of financing, well, let's say elsewhere, right?
They might have their sources of financing elsewhere, or they just might be useful idiots that are getting their information from the Kremlin.
And useful idiots, I mean, this is not a new term. It has been in existence throughout the Cold War, right?
Right, and I use this term not coincidentally, because this is a narrative that the Kremlin has pushed for hundreds of years, and for a large part of the 20th century. The useful idiots in the West during the Cold War parroted the Kremlin narrative for Western audiences, and the Kremlin is using the same technique now to get Westerners to think of Ukraine through the lens, through the filter of Moscow.
And that's one of the things, right? Another Another thing has been, for example, that Ukraine is to blame for the war, or that this is a proxy war between the US and Russia. Things like that, again, which have their source at the Kremlin itself.
Of course, and if you control the language, if you control the narrative, the battlefield in which this narrative takes place, you can control how people think about this war. One thing I want to point out here is with the spelling, what's especially nasty about what the Kremlin is doing is that if you just point to someone and call them a name, you call them a Nazi, people are going to know that you're just name calling, that that's an ad hominem. But what the Kremlin is doing is it's using implicit accusations. So, for example, they'll talk about how Ukraine needs to be denazified. So they're not directly calling them Nazis. They're saying, well, we need to get rid of the Nazis. And the unaware viewer or listener might think, oh, maybe there's some Nazis that I don't know about. And it's the same thing with language. By using Russian spelling and Russian pronunciations of Ukrainian place names, they're not directly saying that Ukraine doesn't have its own sovereignty and that Ukraine isn't a real country and a real language. They're implicitly saying it. And that's especially...
The power of suggestion, isn't it?
Yes, the power of suggestion is especially harmful here.
Speaking of power of suggestion and indirect influence, could there be an additional problem with the use of artificial intelligence? Now, artificial intelligence obviously takes its so-called knowledge base from sources, and it doesn't differentiate between where these sources come from or what political affiliations they represent. Would you say that this might lead to the resurgence of incorrect spelling just because someone is using AI and does not specify what sort of spelling should be included there?
I would say exactly that. I think you're spot on. And this latest push by the Ukrainian government and Foreign Minister Sabiha comes at an opportune moment when this is becoming a problem again. I mean, we're talking about a process that Ukraine has been going through since the early 90s to get people to use these words correctly and in a way that reflects Ukrainian sovereignty. But right now, as you said, people are more and more using LLMs, AI, without realizing that artificial intelligence, while it may be artificial, is not exactly intelligent, and it doesn't realize that it's parroting the sources that it's ingested to produce these, to generate these texts. And I'm
even outdated sources, like not maliciously placed there, but just outdated. Like you used to, you know, there used to be a convention of talking about Ukraine, the Ukraine, that again has this sort of colonial ring to it, right?
It does, because we used to talk about subjects of foreign empires by speaking of them as the Gambia, the Sudan, the Congo. All of those have disappeared. And in the early 90s, literally days after the referendum in which Ukrainians decided that they no longer wished to be part of the Soviet Union, the West began implementing these changes. Ukraine basically said, drop the, it's cleaner. And within days, the Associated Press stopped calling Ukraine the Ukraine. Now, few people under 40 remember that it was ever called the Ukraine. So that was a very successful operation, but that was one that was taking place only within the English language. Here we have 3 points. And going back to the LLMs, unfortunately, part of it is that large language models are ingesting text that was produced before 1991. Another problem is that they're also ingesting text that's been generated by Russian sources. As far as we can see, large language models cannot yet distinguish between the two because they're not intelligent. They're just statistically generating text.
And it is another challenge for the makers of artificial intelligence to make it less likely to be polluted by sources which are basically placed maliciously. But that is perhaps a topic for a conversation at another time. Arthur Barys was our guest here in our studio. Thank you for coming here today, of course, and for sharing your insight on the subject.
Always a pleasure, Jonasz.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us.